The Entrepreneur's Library, episode 230.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library, the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book that will enable you to grow personally and professionally. Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Welcome back to the EL. Today we have David Livermore, author of Leading with Cultural Intelligence, The New Secret to Success. Welcome, Dave, and thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
Thank you, Wade. Great to be here.
Before we take a deep dive into your book, Leading with Cultural Intelligence, will you take just a moment to introduce yourself? Tell us just a little bit about you personally.
Sure. So my role is to lead the Cultural Intelligence Center, which I'll speak much more about during our time together. But essentially, we have the chance to work with organizations, everything from businesses to universities, governments, nonprofits around the world, to help them work more effectively across cultures. And really, that stems from the work I've been privileged to do personally over the last 20 years of my own career, both through research that I've been a part of, as well as just in a variety of leadership responsibilities I've had with different organizations where I had to somehow fulfill a mission and objective of what we were after as an organization, but also account for the different cultures where we were. So I currently live in Michigan, where our center is based, but I'm originally from the East Coast, and my family and I moved here actually after a period of time living in Singapore. So yeah, it's great to be here today.
Very good. Well, Dave, first off, thank you for sharing a little bit about your background. And now let's jump right into your book, Leading with Cultural Intelligence, The New Secret to Success, which was originally made available back in 2009, but you and I were just talking revised, a very good percentage of the book actually revised and re-released last month. So, Dave, we're going to move quickly.
Yeah.
But our whole goal here today is to cover those top questions that this listener and future reader would like to get answered. And that first one is, what was the inspiration behind writing Leading with Cultural Intelligence?
Yeah, thanks, Wade. So I would say the inspiration for the original edition was we had spent about 10 to 15 years, my colleagues and I, who come from a number of different universities around the world, researching this phenomenon of cultural intelligence. Can you actually measure and predict who's going to work effectively across cultures? And many of the practitioners we talked to, executives, entrepreneurs, senior managers, said, hey, this is great, but it's all buried in academic journals. Can you give us a more practical, user-friendly version of this? So that was really the inspiration of the first book. The first edition of the book was to just put in layperson's language and more leadership-specific how it relates. And then similar in terms of the revision that just came out, there's been a lot of research that's continued over the last 5 to 6 years since the first edition came out. So there's about 25% of the content that now says, in light of the new research, in light of a number of global companies that are now using cultural intelligence, here's what we've learned about it.
So this next question is so relevant because of how many books come out on a daily and monthly basis. And that's that, what makes your book different from others regarding the same or similar topic?
Yeah, great question. And I should preface it by saying I'm deeply indebted to a number of the excellent things that have been out there for years in terms of cross-cultural management. Some of your listeners might be familiar with the work of Hofstede or the Global Leadership Study that's looked at these really large samples of how cultures tend to behave. The part that we found is needed for leading in the 21st century and being part of an entrepreneurial pursuit is no longer is it sufficient to simply learn how to pass business cards or gift-giving protocol, or furthermore, no longer is it fair to say that all Indians are a certain way, or for that matter, that even all millennials are a certain way. And so we found that there was a need for a bit more sophisticated approach that says, okay, there isn't a one-size-fits-all to leadership, but there are some general models that can be used. So our approach was to, based upon research, offer a coherent model that says, okay, here's how you can lead across any number of different cultures without feeling like you have to be an expert everywhere you go.
And Dave, how did you write the book to be read? Is this a book that they can jump in and jump out based on the information they need at that moment? Or did you really write it to be read from front to back?
Yeah, it's a great question because I've written a few books in different ways. Certainly, I did write this thinking that it's best suited to read start to finish. There's a lot of stories that come into it, case studies, etc. Having said that, it also has been organized with kind of best practices in each section, pull out case studies. So it can also be used as a guidebook that somebody goes back to. And there's significant part of the book too that gets very specific in terms of saying, hey, if you're working in China, here are some things to bear in mind that you may encounter when you're there. So it's a bit of both. It'd be, I suppose it's every author's desire that one would find it compelling and interesting to read start to finish, but certainly can also be of use to pick and choose portions that are most relevant.
So Dave, now that we know a little bit of the purpose, the background of the book, I'd like to take the next couple minutes to take a deep dive into the content itself. So will you take the next 5 to 8 minutes and really give this listener, this future reader, a great idea of what your book's all about?
Absolutely. Thanks, Wade. So the book begins by, in a sense, dispelling some of the myths that are out there regarding what it takes to lead effectively across different cultures. And without going through all of those right now, just to share a couple of them. For example, people are often very moved by Thomas Friedman's work, The World is Flat, as am I. I think it's an excellent piece that talks about, hey, a startup in the Philippines may well be able to compete with a Fortune 500 company. Where I find that people take it further than Friedman ever intended is to somehow assume then that, well, the world's becoming more similar everywhere you go. And so one of the things that we challenge right at the front end is saying, hey, if you think you can lead people the same everywhere, that's not necessarily fair. On the other hand, one of the myths that we dispel up front is the thought that you somehow have to become an expert at every culture you're going to encounter, because the more that we get engaged in entrepreneurial activity, the more that we find we may be encountering dozens of cultures in a given day. So the front end of the book is just to kind of say, hey, here's some things that are often said about what it takes to be a global entrepreneur, what it takes to be an effective global leader. Let's challenge some of the inadequacies of that. And then most importantly, then to launch into what is it that does make someone effective working across cultures. So as I mentioned, when you asked about the inspiration to the book is largely oriented around answering what we've been seeking to research now as researchers for the last 20 years, across more than now 70 different countries around the world, 50,000 global professionals we've surveyed. And the question that we've been interested in asking is this: well, what's the difference between leaders, between entrepreneurs, between organizations that succeed working across multiple different cultures and those that fail? And then essentially the book unpacks our findings. And essentially what we found was that the leaders who can move in and out of any number of different cultural contexts without necessarily being an expert at all of them, but still having some sense of effectiveness wherever they go, have 4 capabilities that consistently emerge. And the primary content of the book, the middle section of the book, walks through these 4 capabilities. And I'll just briefly reference what they are now, talk about how the book sheds light on them, and then we can kind of interact further about questions you may have. So the 4 capabilities that consistently emerge among those who are culturally intelligent, the first one is CQ Drive. CQ is the way we abbreviate cultural intelligence, like IQ, so CQ Drive. And this first capability is just the degree to which one is interested and motivated in different cultures and sees it as relevant to their entrepreneurial success. So this chapter goes into just specific strategies of how do you bear in mind that the need to make your new idea, your new innovation, something that would be appealing to different markets within the same domestic context or internationally. So the drive piece sounds fairly obvious, like, hey, people who are successful are people who are interested and motivated in different cultures, but we find it's something that is often overlooked. The second capability that the culturally intelligent leader and entrepreneur has is that they have what we call high CQ knowledge. And that is that they have an overall grasp of the similarities and differences that tend to exist across different cultures. So these would be things that I'm sure many of your listeners have encountered before in their reading on cultural differences or a course that they may have taken. That'd be things like, the norm in India would be a very kind of top-down chain of command kind of authority structure that's used, whereas the norm in many Scandinavian cultures would be a much more flat. And of course, you see these differences across different organizations in the US too. When I step onto Facebook's campus, it's a very flat, egalitarian organization to how you influence people. Whereas, if I deal with some of the other organizations, a GE would be a much more authoritarian, though certainly there are some exceptions to that as well. So all that to say, CQ knowledge is not so much can someone spout off, do they know exactly where China is, or do they know exactly where a Latino working in Southern California would fall, but do they have a grasp overall of these general taxonomies, these general differences? And the book gets into just some very specific case studies of how that plays out. The third piece, so the first one was CQ drive, the second was CQ knowledge. The third is the piece that I think might be most useful to the readers that we've encountered. That's the CQ strategy piece, and that is to say, once we have these basic categories of how cultures tend to be similar and different, now what? How do I use that insight to determine an effective innovation strategy, a way to roll something out? Many of the leaders that I interact with say, okay, but I'm not just dealing with Indians, or I'm not just dealing with millennials. I'm leading a team that has a variety of cultural differences, different generations, different ethnicities, different international cultures. So how am I supposed to strategically lead all of them as part of the same team? And that's what we really get into with that strategy piece, referring to some best practices for how one can lead strategically. And then the fourth piece, CQ action. This is the degree to which an entrepreneur says, how much should I adapt? Who should adapt to whom? And when is adapting not always the right thing? And so we look at some organizational examples that remind people that adaptation is a piece of it, but that we don't want to go too far. So, for example, Starbucks shares the example of when they first moved into China. They primarily offered tea drinks. They decorated their coffee shops to look very much like a traditional Chinese tea house. And many of the Chinese customers were incensed that they wanted to get the venti mocha they were able to order when they were in New York or in London, and not order a tea that they could get far better at any of the number of local tea houses. So in some ways for Starbucks, it was better to not adapt and to actually offer some of the distinctives. Well, of course, some adaptation was needed. So in that last piece, we talk about to what degree should they adapt or not adapt. So the book primarily walks through that model. We have full assessments that allow people to assess where they are on those four capabilities, along with interventions for drive, knowledge, strategy, and action. And then finally, the last part of the book kind of answers the so what question. Okay, great. Let's say I can improve my cultural intelligence in all these areas. What kind of ROI can I anticipate as an individual leader and for an entrepreneurial activity as a whole? What are the results that we can anticipate when people's cultural intelligence improves? So that's essentially what the book covers. It's uniquely suited to the individual who is wanting to lead effectively or market a new product or idea across a diversity of cultures, and say, without somehow thinking that you have to be an expert at every culture. On the other hand, you don't want to ignore the relevance of cultural differences. So how do you factor this in to the skill set that you use in order to work effectively wherever you find yourself?
Wow. Dave, you just went through a ton of information in a very short period of time. That was extremely well done. Many authors say that they have never had the opportunity to do this, to break down their book in 5 to 8 minutes. And it seems like you were professional at it. It seems like you've done this before. But so you did a fantastic job of breaking it down, putting the book in a nutshell. And now I'm going to ask you to even take it one step further.
Sure.
And that's that if the reader could only take away one concept, principle, or action item out of everything you just discussed with us, every single thing that's in your book, what would you personally want that to be?
You know how painful this is for an author, right?
See, that's what I say. I preface this question to most authors as, hey, this is a fairly mean question. They're like, oh, it's not mean. I'm like, I kind of feel like it.
Yeah, and actually, but it's not too tough for me to say as it relates to this, because I would say the primary thing I want people to understand is, unlike some other forms of intelligence like IQ, CQ, and our research shows this, it's not either you're born with it or you aren't. It's a developmental skill set. Anybody can improve their cultural intelligence. So sometimes people say, wow, I just feel like I'm at a disadvantage because I haven't had a chance to travel a lot globally, or I didn't grow up in a highly cosmopolitan, diverse environment. And while that might have prepared others to have a leg up on it, anyone can improve their cultural intelligence. And this book just provides a pathway to say, here's a way to do that. Here's a way to become more effective in how you lead across different cultures.
Very good. So there's been several things that are quote worthy so far in this interview that you've said. And that actually leads into our next question, which is, do you have a favorite quote from your book? Maybe something that you wrote that you like, or that has resonated with your audience? And will you take a second to explain what it means to you?
Sure. So the first quote that came to mind actually isn't my own, but it's a reference to Ken Wilber's work, who's done some work in a fascinating field called spiral dynamics. He says, it's not that I have to agree with everything you say, but I should at least attempt to understand it, for the opposite of mutual understanding is quite simply war. And for me, I frankly get very tired of the political correctness conversation that makes us scared to even enter into conversation with one another. You know, particularly we've been in the throes of that in the U.S. again, and without even getting political about it, just my sense is sometimes I think we've eroded people's effectiveness to work effectively across cultures because we're just scared to even say to someone, so what exactly is your culture's take on X, Y, Z? And on the other hand, to say that we're not asking any of us to give up our own values or our own culture by simply opening ourselves up to another one. So for me, I find that's what people have found perhaps safe and freeing, to go, okay, by opening myself up to this, it doesn't mean that I'm saying everything about my own culture is bad or wrong, but I simply want to look at how I can learn from it. And I'm taking this perhaps a bit further than you intended, Wade, but the last thing I'd say related to that really then fuels into the next work that we're doing, and a book that we'll have coming out next year, that then links more specifically diversity of cultures to innovation. And so we've got some new research that finds when you put diverse teams together and you improve their cultural intelligence, it leads to more innovative outcomes for companies.
No, I'm glad you brought that second part up, and we'll have to reconnect when that book actually launches to get the word out for that one as well. But David, we're going to move away from your book for just a second here, and we're going to ask you for a recommendation. And I always preface this isn't just any, this is the book recommendation. So if there's only one book you could recommend based on the way that it's changed your life, maybe created a paradigm shift or a lifestyle shift, which book would you suggest?
Because I already referenced Ken Wilber, and I'd encourage people to look him up, I'm going to sneak in another one here because I think Wilber's work is significant. It's one that maybe is not as familiar to your listeners as many of the great pieces that are out there already on entrepreneurship and management. It's called The Time Paradox by Phil Zimbardo and John Boyd. It's been out for a number of years, and it's based upon some really deep scholarly psychology research, but it's written in a very accessible way. And it goes beyond kind of the very simplistic things that get talked about in working across cultures, like, does 8 o'clock mean 8 o'clock? I mean, yeah, we all probably get that conversation, and goes much further into, am I somebody who's really oriented toward the future, more toward the past? How does that influence the way I innovate, the way I think about myself and the world? So that if I only get one, that would be the one that I suggest people put on their radar if they haven't already read it, The Time Paradox by Philip Zimbardo and John Boyd.
So I have not had that one recommended yet. And so I appreciate the new book that'll be added to my list. And Dave, before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listeners to not only get more information on you, but also get more information on your book, Leading with Cultural Intelligence?
Of course, yes. Thanks, Wade. So the best place to start is culturalq.com. That's CULTURAL and the letter Q.com. And not only is there information there under the resources link about the book, there's all kinds of information about cultural intelligence, different assessments that are available, lots of free resources that can be downloaded, articles. In terms of my own personal website that's devoted just to the book specifically and to some of the other books I've written, davidlivermore.com is a place where they could get that information along with a sample chapter that they can download for free.
Excellent. So Dave, we'll put the resources, the links in the show notes at the elpodcast.com. So those that we have a very mobile listener base. They are working out, running, driving right now, so they can go back and reflect on those resources that you just gave. And again, thank you so much for coming on and being willing to share your book with us today.
My privilege. Thanks to you, Wade.
Thanks again for listening in today. If you'd like more details on Dave or his book, Leading with Cultural Intelligence, check out the show notes at the elpodcast.com.
Looking for your next book idea? Head over to the elpodcast.com, where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs, with you for free. That's the elpodcast.com. Till the next time, keep it on the EL.